who is our EVP, Executive Vice President at ISA Cybersecurity, and she will kick off the webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you to all of you that are participating with us. We will do our very best not to bore you over the next 60 minutes and to really have a conversation as to an unsecure future. How are we securing things? What do we see as new normals? And please do be at liberty to ask questions and to get involved in this conversation. We have the pleasure today, and I would be remiss not to thank Chris Ruetz, who is the AVP and Country Manager for CyberArk, not only for the strong partnership in working with us at ISA and our extended relationships with some of you as well that have joined us here today, but also in his 5+ years of experience in being the country manager for what we see as privileged access management and other very important identity elements of the security portfolio and programs that we are developing every day. So welcome, Chris, and we look forward to your insights. We also have the pleasure of having with us today Gerry Owens. And Gerry comes to us with a very robust, we joked, by the way, on the number of years that we would share with our audience. So let's just say it's somewhere between 20, 30, maybe even a couple more. And Gerry and I, we are from a very similar vintage. So we hope to share not so much the experiences that we've had historically, but what we are seeing in the face of a pandemic. Gerry has had the opportunity to work as an executive in financial services organizations throughout his career, where he's not only assisted with the framework and management of IT infrastructures, network, but has also been very instrumental in the cybersecurity elements of how those organizations have built better cyber programs. So with that introduction, I'm actually going to ask Gerry to just give us a little more depth on your experience in your area of expertise. Gerry?
And thank you, Enza. And it's probably the first time that my tenure with an organization has been compared to the age of a bottle of wine. So I do appreciate that insight. And so, I've had the fortune of working well over 30 years in the banking industry. In fact, I had worked for one bank, and that was TD up until about 2 years ago when I had retired. And I've had the pleasure of seeing a number of changes through a number of, I'd say, I characterize it as decades now, where I've had an opportunity to lead large infrastructure teams. We did a large outsourcing initiative, one of the largest in Canada, probably 15 years or so to IBM at the time. It was well popularized at the time of the outsourcing. And then I had an opportunity to lead a number of teams building capabilities on the cybersecurity front. And of course, back then it was called information security. Cyber became something that entered the vocabulary about 10 years ago. So building security operations, building business technology risk organizations to interface with multiple CIOs across a federated organization, and then leading up the global identity and access management strategy. And it's been interesting to see both the technology industry mature and develop, as well as the cybersecurity space. So it has been an absolute blast spending time leading those programs. And I really appreciate the privilege of being here and sharing this time with you and those in the industry, the professionals that joined us today.
Thank you, Gerry. We look forward to exploiting your strategies and learning some of those techniques if we can over the short time that we'll be together today. And then Chris, maybe give us just a little bit more insight, as far as your areas that you've had the pleasure of experience throughout your cyber experiences.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm happy to be here today with ISA to partake in this event. So I appreciate you guys putting this on and giving us an opportunity to share some of the trends that we're seeing in the industry too. As for myself, I've been in the industry for over 20 years. I've always worked with leading IT security organizations such as Nortel, Cisco, Westcon. I've been with CyberArk for the last 5.5 years in Canada, managing their business here, and it's been crazy how far privileged access management has come in just a matter of 5.5 years. And when I look at where CyberArk is today, we are clearly the undisputed leader when it comes to privileged access management. which is the critical layer of IT security that protects what we call the keys to the kingdoms. So basically your data, your infrastructure, your assets across the enterprise, in the cloud, and throughout the DevOps pipeline. And 5.5 years ago is really discussions around password management. How do I get it? How do I secure my critical assets? To where now today privilege has exploded to become, endpoint protection, to application to security, to security in the cloud. And today's conversation is definitely very timely, especially when you consider what September represents, which is the National Insider Threat Awareness Month. So insider threat is always near and dear to our heart, and we love to talk about and educate people about it. So, but thank you very much for taking your time today, and to the people who've committed their time.
Awesome. Yeah, so many of you already know who I am. I too have had decades and decades of experience and the pleasure of working in the global market. I would say that my cybersecurity deep dive experience is only the last 3 years, but let's hope that more has happened in the last 3 years. And I've had an opportunity to catch up with some of you that have been working on it for a decade plus. So let's stop talking about ourselves and really start talking about the thing that we seem to talk about almost all the time now, which is, what is our new normal? And when will we see potentially some strategies that come out of how we can continue to secure our digital assets in this new normal? So as we start our chat, I really want to reach out to both Chris and to Gerry and help us understand, what does the new normal look like today? What does that mean from a cybersecurity perspective? And really, how is it affecting business continuity plans in particular? Gerry, let's start with you.
Certainly, and thanks, Enza. I think, it's interesting. Over the last year, I've been working very closely as a partner with Chris and the CyberArk organization, and I've had an opportunity to speak to probably at this point well over 40 or 50 different customers and partners on their cybersecurity strategies, and most importantly, how they have continued to position themselves for, I think, what we call today's normal. And the reality is we're kind of living in a world that's unrecognizable from where we were. Business operating models have continued to drastically change, and it's moved from a campus-based environment, obviously, to a distributed-based environment where most of the employees, to the extent that they can, are working from flex and remote locations. There's also an incredible strain on the workforce. They have had to try to maintain balance between managing continuity of business while at the same time managing continuity of their own domestic responsibilities and their families and the children. Isolation has continued to cause an increase in mental health illness across the globe. We've heard studies from Forbes and other health facilities in the US, and we've heard from both the Center for Addiction and Mental Health as well as Canadian Mental Health Association that there is a dramatic increase, a marked increase in the number of mental health cases that are being reported. And the co-modality around it is really around both depression and anxiety disorders that people continue to feel because the level of isolation is in place. And then lastly, of course, the workforce is strained because companies are downsizing. And so a lot of employees are having to pick up work that is in addition to their normal responsibilities. And they're doing so at a time where some of them are even worried about what their future is and their career is based on, this notion of a second wave and the fact that companies tried their best to create as little shortfall as they could to withstand the pandemic, but that as it continues longer, then companies continue to be challenged. Now, I would say what came out of this is fascinating, though, because we've actually seen significant and rapid technology transformation that has occurred as a result. And we have seen companies that are accelerating cloud migration so they could take advantage of microservices. And what's interesting is the pace and speed of those changes has been a matter of weeks, which under normal circumstances would have taken likely 18 months to 2 years and several iterations of a business case to transform that level of technology. And if any company ever wondered if they had the culture inherent to support something like agility and agile transformation, I think they've just proven to themselves that they could break those barriers and move faster than they could ever imagine before. notwithstanding the bureaucracy and some of the politics that businesses might have inherent within their own business walls, but they're able to prove their agile capabilities as they move forward, which is really a fascinating part for where we have found ourselves today.
Well said. Chris?
Yeah, for me, great first question. So how is this affecting security? For me, the demand on today's cybersecurity professionals have never been greater to protecting the organization, our economy, our government operations, and essentially our way of life. We're hearing it in the news every day. Not only do we have to help our customers combat these attacks, they're also juggling the workloads, as Gerry had mentioned, just from work to in-home work from home type environments, and at the same time they're trying to defend an attack surface that has expanded exponentially due to COVID. Before, it used to be just within the four walls of the office, but now it's people are working remotely. Cloud is exploding with new services and applications that are out there. So when you look at the new norm, the physical boundaries have all but disappeared. And for us, we've been saying it for a couple of years now, but identity has truly become the new perimeter. Right? It's about identifying who's accessing your network, having timestamps on them, and making sure they're getting the right access to the right tools and capabilities for their job tasks that's out there. And even when you look at some of the trends that we saw at the first of COVID, VPNs, you heard everybody talking about VPNs, and I know some of the studies that they've talked about showed on average about 125% growth, which I think was extremely low, because a lot of organizations that I spoke to definitely seemed a lot higher around that. But although VPNs was a great step, people need to understand VPNs are not designed to provide privileged access. So VPNs do have a traditional purpose and role that they play within this. But when you look at the severe high-profile leaks and breaches that have recently that we've seen within the industry, organizations are forced to re-examine how they need to provide remote access to the most sensitive aspect of their corporate network, which is the assets, right? And when I look at VPN, it is a core element, but there's also a front end piece, which could be tied down with single sign-on or multi-factor authentication, and also the back-end piece, just giving them access to what they have access to, because VPN sort of opens up the door to everything that's out there today. Even on from a survey standpoint, we conducted a survey of 3,000 remote office workers and IT professionals, and some of the habits we found inside too. We talk about from a work and a security standpoint, but working in your own house presents a lot of challenges, and I see that today with 3 kids, all remote and working remote, and trying to challenge on for bandwidth on the same network. But what we found in the study was just people reusing passwords, letting family members use their corporate devices, putting critical business systems and sensitive data at risk. And the problem is, people are the weakest link within the security chain, and there's not been enough education. I know organizations have done a great job trying to pass that along, but again, with the shift in COVID and changing the strategy, there's definitely a lot more education that can be done out there. But we found that with people at home, convenience definitely often outweighs security. So for parents that are trying to juggle at home and childcare and school, they're looking for convenience and not security is not top of mind.
Yeah, that's a very good point. The strategy, I think, of having young children at home is figure out what their cyber talents are, their security talents, and put them to work. Allow them to be less disruptive, and I think that we're all quite patient. Those are all very good points. Mental health, acceleration to cloud, identity at the perimeter, understanding not just where my crown jewels from a digital asset perspective, but how do I know that you're coming in from, regardless of who your telco is, whatever region of the world, whatever hops you may take, but that I can identify that you should have access to the information that I'm serving up from these new unknown originating points. A couple other perspectives from a service provider. ISA operates a SOC 2 Type 2 facility with managed and hosted services. There's always a physical security element to what we do in maintaining our certifications, our regulatory compliance, and attesting to that on an annual basis that these physical as well as digital and biometric type controls are in place. We were able to send our team home from our security operations centers within 3 days. And, multi-factor identification for sure, making sure that we understood identity, strengthening our network, and then following those regulatory compliance, changing rules. And then, so looking at it from the perspective of how do we maintain our PCI certification and all of really the routes and reporting that are regulatory compliance in a time where information is moving quickly, whether it's moving to the cloud, whether we're allowing access from a different medium to that information. So those are a couple of other areas to consider when we look at what's the new normal. And then please jot down if any of these particular areas you'd like a little more information, and we will address them in our talk time. One thing that should also be mentioned is, we talk about the new normal. Here's what hasn't changed. Ransomware is still the #1 threat financially. Yeah. Threat actors are growing at a propelled rate that even the analysts are having challenges. So, in our new normal, there are still some constants where we provide, from a cybersecurity perspective, the protection that our corporate and our personal lives really dictate are needed in what we're calling our new normal that's evolving. Let's move on to really, our next point of conversation, which is, in the last 6 months, how are you seeing that cybersecurity leaders within their organizations are taking a stronger and more strategic role within those organizations? Can you share and explain some of the trends that you are seeing? And Chris, this time we'll start with you on how, leaders are accepting the risks that they're taking or that they're not prepared to take.
It's funny when I hear about the risks that cybersecurity leaders are taking. I always think of that image on LinkedIn where you show the CEO, the CFO sleeping, but the CISO is wide awake there, and I truly believe that with what's going on now. But some of the risks that are being taken is there's definitely more responsibility at a CXO level, so more executive alignment with the CISO and the CIO, the CFO, and the CEO. A lot more board discussions because it's no longer just, are we going to get breached? What are the ramifications around that? But boards are definitely concerned about their reputation, about what's going on in the industry, the financial losses, etc., and the intellectual property that's being stolen out there. There's a lot of information that I look at the government of Canada right now. They're very concerned about their intelligence around their research around COVID-19. So again, I definitely think this is more alignment at the executive level that we're seeing across the board. I talk about education as sort of being the weak link, but I definitely see a lot more focus put around that from security leaders because, again, people are the weak link within the security chain. So people are putting a lot of focus on just educating the users on, best awareness, what to do on a day-to-day basis, phishing emails, how to detect that, right, and be aware of some of the threat stuff that's out there. From a vendor and strategic standpoint, I'm a big believer in security is a team game. So I've been involved with a lot of discussions around consolidating. There's a lot of mishmash out there of different technologies and tools, and a lot of cybersecurity leaders are taking that leadership role, saying we are going to align key leaders in the industry and consolidate and sort of find that vendor that can scale across wider and deeper within certain key areas, and how do they align with other key vendors out there in the space. And the last one I would say I'm seeing a lot more trend on is just more red team exercises. They're definitely taking security in their own hands. Some of them are building red teams internally within their organization and trying to detect the threats and be proactive in that steps. Other ones continue to rely on outside help through third parties, but that's always a great way to help find out where the weak links are within your environment.
Terrific. Gerry, can you elaborate on the trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, and I would echo exactly what Chris has said. I think prior to the pandemic, many companies, although from some of the discussions I had, I would say not as mature as they would like to have, but many companies have been more effectively communicating cybersecurity across the organization. And I would agree that board awareness of cybersecurity and technology risks has continued to improve. And I think in many cases, at least larger corporations, board directors, many of them would have some level of a cybersecurity knowledge or background that they would take to the board and help provide that degree of translation at board speak that's coming from CISOs and other C-level executives across the organization. I'd also say that organizations themselves are starting to see their full accountability when it comes to IT risk policies and procedures. Many companies have adopted the phrase "security is everyone's responsibility." So it's not just up to the CISO to make sure that the security teams are in fact the ones behaving, responsibly and securely. The whole organization is responsible for the safety of the assets and the technology that they rely on to perform their transactions. And then, stronger partnerships with the CIO and business leaders across the organization so that the principle, and I think the time is greater now than ever before, that the principle of security by design becomes adapted within most of the technology stack within the organization. So again, that it doesn't become a function of pure remediation. Now, I think as they continue to grow it, I think there's more opportunity to continue communicating security across the organization. And there's often the balance between, I would say, security risks and rewards. So I think making sure that there is strong alignment to your IT risk policies and your corporate risk policies that demonstrate the security that's in place, the investments you're making, and how, in fact, they roll up and align to your overall risk posture and tolerance across the organization. I think effective communications on new threats and how they can impact business. And sometimes you have to do a little bit of customization of that message, depending on the nature of business you're communicating it to, so that they understand the threat in real terms and they understand how that could then impact their business in a way they hadn't considered before. I think this concept of centralized governance and gating could in fact be a little bit undermined in a distributed world. And so I think making sure that from a technology standpoint, we see CIOs and CISOs talking more around how they unify their approach to change management and incident and crisis management and how they can bring uniformity to the way in which they manage problems throughout. And then I would say, and I think Chris sort of touched upon this as a final point, and that is, I think they're taking a stronger role in the organization's move towards third-party management. So in many cases, in a lot of organizations, managing security for third-party was often treated differently than the corporate strategic sourcing organization would manage third-party. One was all about services and revenue, and the other was all about controls and audits. And I think there's an emergence of bringing those together so that the policies of managing third party for security type controls and principles and being able to demonstrate those is now being measured as part of the corporate oversight for that third party. And that becomes important because as more organizations have now shifted businesses to the cloud, it becomes fundamentally important for the CISO to communicate to the organization inherent risks to the data that might exist as a result. And what they're communicating to the businesses across the organization, to all C-levels, is that you might be outsourcing your technology to third party, but you cannot outsource your risks. You're still fully responsible and accountable for those risks. And that strategically needs to be understood across the entire organization.
Yeah, very good point there on the shared risk responsibility.
Yeah, what we're seeing as well is we have a few large global organizations that operate in multiple regions of the world. And cyber and their cyber leadership is the first area that they've consolidated physical geographies and having really one strategic cyber plan where the global CISO reports directly into the CEO of the organization. We've seen this twice in the last 3 months, where cyber becomes not just about, risk and compliance on the risk side of our businesses, on, digital security operations, but a reputational impact potentially to our business. But realistically, we need to understand that, cybersecurity poses a large threat, and it has a seat at the table to determine what our strategy is in putting in what you said then, Gerry, as far as sort of gating and being able to maintain an agile problem-solving approach so that we can react to a pandemic. We can react to a crisis, which is uncharted ground for us, and be able to respond to the demands of that business. So that's a trend that we're seeing, where the CISOs are reporting very, very high, even at the board level. In some situations, as far as strategic reporting is concerned, they have a seat at the board table to present and continue to de-risk. The other thing that we're seeing, and Chris, I love the way that you said that cyber is security is a team game.
Security is a team game, yes.
Sorry, security is a team game. What does that mean? As we change and we look at the new normal with the remote workforce, things that are very basic, we need use cases, and we need our Active Directory teams and our LDAP teams and our infrastructure experts and our support teams to also work very closely with us to be able to put in the right policy to protect us. And so, the team internally to the organizations, we've seen a good shift where the cyber folks can go and talk to their peers, their colleagues in other areas, and potentially, get better buy-in faster to be able to address some of these needs because it's protecting the entire organization. So we're seeing some of that trend, right? Don't line up so that the Active Directory team will get to your project, in 4 to 6 weeks and when they have a change window. But let's discuss what cyber needs today and how we can put it into production in the current environment that we're dealing with. We're seeing some of that.
Yeah, and we see a lot of that too. Like security as a team game can go on multiple levels, but when we're talking to the security team and they're looking to roll out rules and policies and changes, you got to deal with the security team, the IT team, the operations team, and you really have to communicate across the groups on a clear message of where they're going to. The other aspect too is looking at your solutions that you have, right? And I always tell our customers, I love talking about CyberArk, but I love talking more about how we integrate with other leaders that are out there today, whether it's identity access, whether it's vulnerability scanners, ticketing systems, right? How do we integrate it into a CyberArk solution so we can shrink the attack surface and they can get more value out of the investments that they're making today?
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I think the other thing I'd also mention is that when you talk about communications across the businesses, and I've had this conversation a few times this past couple of months with organizations that have been trying to implement programs, and this probably started before pandemic, and it's likely going to become an issue during pandemic because you just have that degree of remoteness that complicates that interaction even more. But I recall a conversation where an organization was having trouble with their cybersecurity policies and communicating to them, and to their customers, their business partners, to them it looked like a whole bunch of rules and bureaucracy and things to overcome as a result of cybersecurity controls that had to be implemented. And they cited that they had a real estate organization that needed to do a lot of transfers of information through either USB sticks or whatever the medium was for transferring communications. And they couldn't understand why the security team was standing in the way. So they had actually put up a communication plan to sit in front of the partners and sort of talk about some of the different circumstances that the real estate organization has been asking for in terms of the capabilities to interact and information exchange. And then they walked through a series of headlines around vulnerabilities, exploits, breaches, and attacks that were aligned to some of those technologies that created situations for companies. And once the business partners became educated around the type of security that was vulnerable, and how that then impacted their business processes, they were quite interested in transforming the business culture and finding a way that they could transact with their partners, find ways to exchange information, but at the same time remain aligned to cybersecurity principles so they're protecting information. And the relationship itself, as it was described to me, had a 360 turn in terms of how much they themselves felt that they were accountable to security, and they embraced the concept of the things that they had to be concerned about when they were performing this type of interaction. And I think it then becomes that team sport. And so whether it's vendors working together to bring in a solution that helps bring a stronger security footprint to a customer to reduce that attack surface that Chris has described, but it also has to do internally within an organization for the organization themselves to understand the headlines that they see on the news and how that relates to the principles of security and controls that are implemented and how that impacts them as a business. And it also impacts their business processing, the developers that create the applications, and that security becomes a team sport, gets embedded into the design of solutions, not the back-end remediation. So I think Chris Enza is right. That is a very powerful statement.
Awesome. I think my dad said that players win the game because I'm a big golf fan, and that teams win championships because he was a big hockey fan. I always related it to that, and of course, that always comes top of mind for me. Good conversation. You know, for you, the invitees and the participants of our conversation today, we want to share these strategies with you. We want to help you understand some of the experiences that we've had. We want to have an idea sharing conversation with you. So please keep in mind that it's not just about today. Today's the beginning of, you know, allowing us to all exploit Gerry a little more and take advantage of the experiences and some of the advancements, and of course, Chris, some of your insights as well. So please feverishly talk about longer term goals and how we might be able to extend this conversation for you in particular to help you with your strategies. As industry thought leaders, you know, we're constantly encouraging the practice of taking responsible course of actions, including really balancing short-term goals against mid-term and longer-term initiatives. Over the last 6 months, you know, how have you seen these goals change? What fundamental changes are we seeing? Chris, sorry.
I can definitely take that one first. So lots of goals. Definitely we see the short-term goals, we see the long-term goals. I know in our space when it comes to identity and privileged access, I would say that's probably the biggest vulnerability that a lot of organizations have today. And it's just because it hasn't had a lot of attention. And when you look at privileged access security, people think of password management, but again, it's around identity security, endpoint protection, application security, and cloud. And that's where I find a lot of customers can get overwhelmed when they look at, you know, what are the short-term goals, what are the long-term goals that I have to work for, right? And you know, one of the things we saw this with our customers was this gap in knowledge. And one of the things we helped build was a prescriptive guide to privileged access management. And our goal was really to help our customers to develop an effective program that allows them to succeed within the organization, that, you know, strategic guidance that span across people, processes, and technology domains. And the only way you can do this is through years of experience and a proven track record. And for CyberArk, because we've seen and done more than anybody in this space, we've been in the business for over 20 years, we wanted to add our footprint into the space and provide some advice, but not only our advice. We worked with a lot of customers as we built this program, and this program we call the Blueprint, and it's made up of 3 easy to understand risk areas. Everything in our space is all around assessing it from a risk standpoint, and I call them guiding principles. But how do you prevent credential thefts? How do you stop lateral and vertical movements? How do you limit privilege escalation and abuse? And what I love about this program is if it's a short-term goal you're looking to achieve, we show what the necessary steps to get started are needed, but you're also looking at the long-term goal because, again, privileged access, there's multiple layers to securing it. So within this Blueprint program, we sort of take that short-term view, we take the long-term view, because I think it's important that they get the overall view of where they're trying to take the organization and communicate that within the organization. Some of the short-term goals that I've seen too is more executive briefing sessions we've seen from our customers, because again, they are interested in talking to our executives, seeing the trends that are going on, but more importantly, they want to talk to our product management team, our R&D team. They want to see what the future risks that we're seeing in the space here. What are we doing to develop and evolve our products? This is one area that, you know, we take a lot of pride in, is sort of trying to stay ahead of the game. And you look at our, we've always been big on the privileged access side of things, so sort of the back end side of things. But now we see with the new trend of what's going on, it's really identity security. And that was part of our key acquisition that we had with Idaptive a couple months ago, where we look at everybody has an identity, and that should be managed under one security framework, one platform, whether you're a business user, whether you're a credential user, a human, an application, non-human. But we view that all identities should be under one platform. But there's a lot to look at this, and we try to chunk that up within our Blueprint program to give customers a better view into what's expected, both short term and long term.
Terrific. Well said. You know, one of the things that we're seeing that we're really focused on, I think, goes back to something you said early on, Gerry, which was, you know, the mental health and human elements of it. Some of what we've seen change in short and mid and longer term goals is assisting our staff and our partners and the people that we interact with, our customers, to feel safe from a COVID-19 perspective, let's call it out, right, from a pandemic perspective. More new goals around, you know, a healthy and safe workforce. Addressing some of the concerns from a new working environment that not only our team members will have, but, you know, how our customers are dealing with that. And sharing insights on how we're dealing with it. I think we all saw the first few months of the pandemic, we were online 12 hours a day, from, you know, WebEx to Zoom to Teams, and thank you, Cisco and Microsoft, for both calling a great product Teams. So, you know, we saw some of that, but I think it's still part very much of our short, mid, and long-term planning now. How do we keep our people safe? And how do we get back to some semblance of our new normal in considering the human safety elements that we now should be taking more into consideration than we may have a year ago or a year before that? So on to the next question, or really piece of our conversation. You know, and Gerry, let's start with you this time. What advice do you have for balancing, you know, risk-informed decisions during a crisis?
Yeah, I first of all, great comments on mental health and taking care of the safety of people. Enza, I think you're bang on. I think that's fundamentally important. I'm fortunate enough that my kids are long since out of the nest, so I don't have to worry about having them shutter over my shoulder or share desktops or do the education. But I have neighbors with young children. One works insurance, the other works for Ontario Power. And thankfully, their corporations have been flexible enough to allow them to do the balance. So she does like the 6 to noon shift for her work, and then he sort of gets on around 1 o'clock in the afternoon till later in the day. And I think he helps run some of the training programs. And I watch them choreograph this, and I can't imagine how stressful that was until they got to a point where they could reach this cadence. And I just admire the resolve for doing it. And I admire businesses that actually reached out and said, let's make this work for families and let's try to find that balance. And so it's great to see that that does exist. I think when you talk about sort of balancing risk with the types of decisions that have to be made, I think number one is, and I think you said it, make no mistake, people come first in their stress. So make sure you stay in touch, that you communicate, and that you're spending time with them, making sure that you understand some of their challenges and issues, because as a corporation, you're going to learn. And what I've come to learn in the last few months is that a lot of corporations that have transformed their technology to allow for this large contingent of remote workforce, they're actually planning to stay in that operating mode for a significant period of time. I don't know if forever is too long of a time to speculate on, but I do know for at least the next year, until sometime mid-2021, these companies have decided to maintain that type of operating model. And I think it's wonderful for people like me that spent 30 years taking, you know, an hour and a half transit down to the big city and then back again. I think not having to go through that takes away some of that stress. But I do think that they're going to have to continue to refine their operating model so that they know how they can operate in that. I think, and the other part of this I would say is, I think the pandemic itself has certainly brought on some new challenges from a cybersecurity perspective. And Chris has nailed a number of things that companies have to look out for in terms of, how many of our business processes did we modify in order to allow people to have access, and particularly with this shrinking workforce where we've augmented people's responsibility, and then with extra responsibility comes additional access. And whether that's privileged business access or simple access to perform transactions, there's always an inherent risk when you continue to expand the landscape of access across the organization. And as Chris had said, insider threat now becomes something that organizations still make sure that they're grounded to, and that they understand the components of security and controls and things that are in place that monitor against it. But I'd also say that you always have to sort of take a step back and ground yourself and say, what are the risks across our organization? What are the key assets and the business transactions most vulnerable to the organization? And make sure that your security framework and your IT risk framework that was born out of the necessity to manage against these critical assets or these crown jewels or these high-level, high-risk transactions, that you haven't compromised those. And that as you continue to build out your networks and you look at remote connectivity and a large contingent remote workforce, it's just making sure that you still have those types of controls around access management and privileged access and network connectivity that still ensures you have the right degree of protection against those assets. And similarly, and I said this before, and if many of those assets have been outsourced to a service provider, a cloud services provider, then it's making sure you have the right framework in place to manage third-party services and how they're managing the criticality of your assets and services. I'd also say that it's important to continue working with the business lines and making sure that businesses continue to assess the risk associated with their applications. What are the things that the businesses are most worried about when it comes to their applications? Obviously, piracy of information, and Enza, you said this before, ransomware attacks. Shopify, I think, just had an insider threat program. And by coincidence, my daughter had just wrote a provincial nursing exam yesterday. She couldn't get into the site to see her mark because the Ontario Nursing Foundation had been hacked and they were held for ransomware. And so this has become incredibly pervasive across the industry. And what you're finding now is how do I manage that balance of risk to make sure that we're still continuing to manage our crown jewels and our assets while we still continue to create that convenience for our business lines and our remote workforce and invest in those technologies so that we're still continuing to protect our assets at the back end. But I'd summarize this by saying, and it's fairly simple, make sure that you do have an IT risk strategy and a cybersecurity strategy, and revisit that strategy in the context of the new infrastructure changes you made relative to the pandemic to ensure that you haven't compromised any of those controls that could exploit those assets or those processes themselves. I think is fundamentally the first thing that you need to do. And then the second, obviously, is just to make sure that as you align those security practices and you have the right monitoring and measurement in place, so that you are making the right level of investments against the controls that you think you need to augment as a result of the fact that you've created new channels into your organization, and that you no longer have this concept of perimeter protection because your perimeter has now been expanded down to the endpoint, and that access management now becomes the new perimeter. So it's making sure that you're always looking at your roles in the organization, mapping that to the access and entitlements that they have across the organization, and that you're looking at your privileged access accounts and you're continuing to manage those for that degree of appropriateness across your business lines.
Very good, very good. Chris?
I guess for me, Gerry touched up on a lot of good points there. And when we look at balancing the risks-informed decisions during a crisis, first and foremost for me is just understand the risks before you react, right? Nothing's worse than having a reaction there, understanding what level of risk there is to the organization and how you can you attack that. But I'll take it a different angle because Gerry did such a good job talking about some of the risks there. But what can you do prior to the crisis, right? And there's a lot of great things that organizations can do, and really trying to predict what are the risks in your organization. And I know it's not just us, but there's other partners or vendors that provide, assessment tools that they can take advantage of. One of them that CyberArk provides is a discovery and audit. and it really allows you to understand the threat landscape from a privileged access standpoint and gives you data that you need to make decisions. What I love about these reports too is they're tied in with KPIs. So this is reports that you can run on a quarterly basis, take it to the board and show them the progress you're making to mitigate that risk within your environment. A new report we just actually launched recently called SkyArc, and it's really to expand where we see the next threat vector, which is really around cloud, right? So what does the threat landscape look like in the cloud? Now, this is an area that's exploding for organizations as they're moving digital transformation in their business to the cloud. They have to understand what are the pathways to privilege when you're looking at a cloud environment there on that side.
Yeah, no, that's also a good point. You know, let's look at how do we perceive, or what risks can we assess that we may look at. You know, what we're seeing as far as a trend in many industries, and this is not exclusive to large enterprise, but really it hits the gamut when it comes to, you know, digital security or cybersecurity, is that organizations are starting to look at getting the risk teams more involved, which are normally, you know, governance, compliance, not necessarily our security operations folks, right? Or not our blue teams, our red teams, our purple teams, you know, whatever color we would like to call that particular specialty team. But it's about understanding your tolerance to loss. Chris, I really like what you said about, you know, audit and remediation, right? Getting closer to what are we doing to not just look at making risk-based decisions, but what is our tolerance for loss? Because we are going to have to make decisions a little faster with less data. Once again, if we look at the pandemic and some of the medical information that's being shared, you know, many different sources, things are moving very quickly. There's not enough of a baseline. You're going to find some of that in the risk decisions that the organizations are looking at, but the new risk that is entering the organization, some of it is visible, some of it is not. And I think being able to work closely with your GRC teams to understand, you know, what is the loss or risk tolerance, so that you can start to implement strategies that, you know, you can't know what we don't know, but we will be ready from two different angles as it relates to cyber risk in our organizations.
Well said.
So on a more personal note, and you know, Chris, I'm going to ask you this question first and really to lead us in this aspect of our conversation. But, you know, how are you and your organization fostering a culture of cyber resiliency? And, you know, what are some of the tips that you'd offer other people and or organizations that are struggling with this? Cyber resiliency.
Oh, wow. That's a great question there. And it can go down multiple paths here on our side. But, you know, from a cyber resiliency standpoint, you know, for us, it's really education, right? We do a good job educating the current threats within our environments. We have our CISO who communicates to us on a quarterly basis. We have security bulletins. We have, you know, obviously we're an organization that gets tons of phishing emails. How do we identify it? How do we protect our jewels to our data and intellectual properties there? But from a CyberArk standpoint, I think it's really open communication. We have a clear, defined strategy within our organization too. We understand what we represent to other organizations too. It's not just CyberArk, but it's our platform that supports other organizations that are out there on that area. But some of the tips I would say for organizations that are struggling around this is, you know, aligning yourself with key partners that have been through this and are providing the great advice to organizations on steps that they need to take, so they can assess where their current state is, where do they need to be to, or where they need to go to over the next few years. Having measurable KPIs, right? That's always key. It's nothing's worse than trying to invest in stuff and a year later you don't know where it's gone or what investments you've made. Having KPIs in there to measure the stuff that's out there. Leveraging the vendors that you have, not just the partners, but the vendors also have tools and capabilities to provide insights into where you're struggling and where you can take advantage of. This is actually one of the areas that I do love about CyberArk is our customer success organization. Their job there is to really help organizations take our product to a next level and making sure they're using the tools correctly, tips and tricks around it, giving advice on what they're seeing in the marketplace. So it's not just their environment, but they work with multiple customers across Canada, and they can see some of the good things that are going on and provide that feedback as they're working with other organizations that may be struggling, giving suggestions on how other organizations tackled the specific situation.
Well said, well said. Gerry, why don't you elaborate on that?
So I think, and I've seen a lot of what CyberArk's been able to put in place, both for their own employees and the type of communications that they've sort of streamlined to help keep, I think, all of the team members informed. I think the big key during this period in time is just extensive communications awareness and training. I think I can't put too fine a point on that. I think organizations have become pretty adept at understanding the risks that they're consuming with this type of remote access and some of the changes they had to make in business process changes. And so I think overall they continue to look at their risk strategy and make sure that they're investing in the right level of controls for those risks. But I think when it comes to employees working at home, I think the security staff themselves, although I think there's the odd instance where you see even a security staff member might make a bit of a mistake. But the security staff themselves would understand strong controls and security within their own environment, within their own home-based Wi-Fi network and the security controls on their desktop. And in many cases, security people are probably working with their corporate laptops and desktops anyway. I think, though, from an overall business perspective, and I was speaking to a colleague in the airline industry where they themselves have, as you can imagine, have gone through incredible attrition. And I think they just continue to communicate with their teams and they kind of break it up into segments where they'll talk about the security principles and good behavior and the sort of things to be concerned about when you're working with a desktop that is your home desktop and you're accessing business services to do your work. But they're also very big on communications around where we are today as an industry and as a corporation, and how we're being impacted by what we see today and where we're seeing successes and what the forecast in the future is. I have a young lad that's in the hospitality business, in the hotel business, and he's probably on his third notification of a furlough because in the downtown core, hotel businesses and conferences just aren't happening. And they're not going to happen for probably the next, I would say, 18 months. I don't see large masses of corporations getting together the way they traditionally did in the past. And I think from their perspective, the one thing I do admire out of that is that they've constantly communicated with the employees on what is going on, what's taking place, and what sort of things that you should look out for, and how we can help you as you continue to sort of navigate through your career and decide what you want to do. If we take that back down to the conversation we're having today around cybersecurity, I think the more knowledgeable the employees are around what the corporation is doing and the more empathy they have for the decisions a corporation has to make, and the more communications, awareness, and training that takes place so that they fully understand that the weapon they have, and it is a weapon because they use it to provide productivity to their organization, but virtually in the hands of the wrong people, it becomes a weaponized way of accessing information within that corporation. And I think that awareness and training is important for them to continue making sure that they're mindful of the security and the concerns around using their desktop to perform these types of business transactions. And so communications and transparency, I think, is a key fundamental success factor, particularly as we move through this era of the pandemic.
Yes, I agree with really quite a bit of what you have both described in this area. From an ISA perspective, we are seeing massive growth in our security awareness and our hosted services. From a social engineering perspective, it enables our customers to leverage, their knowledge, learning systems that they've always had internally for their employees, but it allows them to really look at how the individuals are interacting with the technology that they're using every single day, and allows for different strategies to be able to adapt. So, you know, more gamification in the groups that learn better that way. You know, more complex phishing and vishing and other campaigns for the security team, right? They're going to recognize us the minute they see us. And so continuing to evolve in the area of security awareness and building strong educational campaigns that help different user groups at the complexity in which they understand the risks to the organization is important. And then to really dovetail that into celebrating the successes. So there are quantifiable analytics that will help you understand. My organization is, you know, a 1 out of 5, no different than a SANS Top 20 or other frameworks that help you take that journey with your people and your culture to ensure that people are aware of cyber threats, because cyber criminals and victimology, cyber threat is changing every single day, right?
Absolutely.
We need to be ready for that. So, you know, these events wouldn't happen without great support from people like Batul and Julie and Michelle. And I'm going to just take a moment and I'm going to introduce Michelle Tam. She has a couple of questions that have come from you, the participants, that we would like to address. Michelle?
Thanks, Enza. Yeah, so I think one of the top questions received come through was about, you mentioned quite a bit on, you know, security awareness within the organization and how employees really play a part in that whole security strategy. But also you guys are all leaders. How does, you know, with all this change in the new normal and the remote work, how have you supported your remote staff, and from a mental health perspective as well, not just, you know, efficiency and productivity, but also, you know, the well-being of your employees?
So Enza, you and I had a conversation yesterday or the day before when we were sort of having a conversation around these topics, and you shared some of the work that's being done at ISA, and I was quite impressed with how much thoughtfulness went into working with the employees and creating that level of employee inclusiveness and ensuring that we understood mental health and awareness across the organization. Perhaps you should take us through it, because I think it was a great story.
Yeah, and you know, I'll take credit for it because my boss, Kevin Dawson, our CEO and leader, is not on the call.
Nice.
Maybe I'll give him a little bit of credit for some of the thought leadership that he provided in that area. I've always been a firm believer that our people are our biggest asset. And in these interesting times of isolation and, Gerry, many of the other factors, you know, some of us were road warriors, constantly traveling regions of North America. And so our day-to-day work life has changed in many aspects. The human connection that we get. So ISA actually embarked pre-COVID in understanding, you know, being vulnerable in our roles and empathy. We started with our leadership team. But through the COVID early days, we were aware that some people were challenged either with the extended work hours, the lack of change. And so the psychological aspect of that, we have a favorite saying, we are not trained professionals. What does that mean? We're not psychologists. But we do have trained professionals that we have on retainer and on staff that are available to our people. We also provided a couple of mental health days to all of our employees over the summer months for them to realize that we believe that it is important for them to take a mental break. Because this repetitiveness of our new normal can be a little trying. And, you know, get out, go for a hike, take a walk, spend time with your loved ones, turn your 12-hour workday into an 8 or 10-hour workday. And to really help each individual understand that, you know, your mental health through this, or how you are dealing, what your resiliency and coping skills are to COVID and how it's impacted our work life, and how that has also impacted some of our personal lives, is important. So multiple strategies, people first, and our people are our biggest asset. So for those of you from ISA that are on here, if you have any questions related to that, just call me right after this, because hopefully we've had some of these conversations. but we want you to enjoy what you're doing. We want to embrace your new strategies in our new work environment. And we thank you for always being available through this time of crisis. Gerry, did I cover it? Are there other strategies that you would like to add?
No, I think you covered exactly what we had discussed and you had talked about. So thank you for that. I think that's admirable.
Yes. We are at the top of the hour. I do want to be respectful. Are there any questions from the audience themselves that you have not forwarded to Michelle that you would like to address? And I think we'll give you, 5 seconds to unmute yourself. Take our last question. Very good. So in lieu of the fact that we are at the top of the hour, what we will do is we will address the question that Michelle has not had an opportunity to ask, and we will get follow-up information to all of you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your patience. We hope that this is the beginning of a longer conversation. Let us know how Chris, Gerry, or I can answer any questions or share any strategies that we've seen work over the last 6 months. Or really, if you just want to brainstorm and share some ideas. Julie, back to you.
Thanks, everyone, for your time today. Chris, Gerry, thank you again. I wanted to remind everyone who has participated and stayed with us for the full hour that we will be reaching out to provide you with the one CPE credit. And thank you again for your participation. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you, everyone.